One thing that you may not know about me is that if you'd asked me in high school what I wanted to do when I was older, I probably would have told you that I wanted to be a politician. Wanted to be in politics. I wanted to serve people. I wanted to lead people. And it was a really cool thing that my senior year of high school, I actually got a chance to shadow the governor of South Carolina for a day, Mark Sanford, while at the same time my twin sister shadowed the lieutenant governor of the day, Andre Bauer. So such a neat opportunity. I arrived at the South Carolina State House so excited to meet the governor and see what he did all day, and he greeted me first thing in the morning and said, "Well, I've got very important meetings all day. You can stay with my aides." So I walked into a back room, barely bigger than a closet, with his aides. And we sat in silence for a while, but eventually I got up the courage to ask them, "So what do you do?" And they said, "Well, we find out who votes against the governor in the House and the Senate, and we go into their home districts and spread bad stuff about them." And it wasn't till the very end of the day, the last 15 minutes, that the governor gave me any time. And of course, the reason that he did was because the TV cameras were on, rolling to do a news story about shadowing the governor for the day. It doesn't help that my sister had an awesome day with the lieutenant governor doing all kinds of fun, cool stuff. But and eventually, if that name, Mark Sanford, rings a bell, he was later disgraced by a scandal and he ran off to Argentina with his mistress. Same governor. As you can imagine, that day was part of the reason I decided I didn't want to go into politics, because politics seemed to be all about positioning yourself on top of others, right? To influence, to get the endorsement, to get the vote, to stay on top of other people. And I just couldn't be part of that struggle to be on top. After the transfiguration on the mountain, Jesus and his disciples are walking, and in just a span of a few verses, Jesus gives his disciples 3 distinct lessons on how to properly position themselves in the world. And as you can imagine, these are very different from the lessons of American politics. First, he says, the Son of Man will be betrayed into human hands and killed. Which on the surface is a very weird thing to say, because the Son of Man is this heavenly, divine Messiah figure. The Son of Man doesn't die. I'm sure the disciples also thought by following Jesus, they were making themselves have a better position in the world. They thought they might have more power, that they might be the ones on top. Because no one willingly puts themselves in a position to die. But as they continue to walk, the disciples, not unlike politicians, start to argue about who is the greatest among them. Who is in the best position? Who's the one who's closest to Jesus? Who's the one with the power, the top dog, the first chair? But again, Jesus tries to reposition them. If you want to be top dog, Jesus says, try putting yourself last. Which again, is a very weird thing to say, because it just goes against every instinct that you and I have. But finally, as if to drive his point home just a little more, Jesus sees a little child and picks her up and gives them one more lesson. Do you want to know the best position to be? Look at this child. You really want to show me that you are the best? Make her feel safe and welcome and included. And not just when the TV cameras are running. Don't just roll out the red carpet for all the most important people. You make this child feel at home. You've made me feel at home. I've read an article this week called "My Problem with the Bible." And with a clickbait title like that, you just have to see what the article's about. So of course, I click on it. And it turns out the author's problem with the Bible was its positioning. The author writes, one of the most remarkable things about the Bible is that we're told a narrative from the perspective of the poor, the oppressed, the enslaved, the conquered, the occupied, the defeated. And we know that history is usually written by the winners, and this is true, except in the case of the Bible, when it's the opposite. In other words, when people like you and me try to understand the Bible, we try to read it from a worldview of a Hebrew slave or an oppressed Roman colony, but that's just not where you and I are in the world. We're much closer to the Egyptians and the Romans and the Pharisees. The article even imagines a scenario where Jesus comes today announcing a reversal of positions of power. And how do modern people receive this? The author imagines people in certain parts of the world saying, "When do we start?" And Americans saying, "Hold on now, Jesus. Let's not get carried away." And so when Jesus lifts up this child and says, "The first shall be last," we can almost hear the disciples saying back to Jesus, because we can hear that same voice in our head saying, "Hold on now, Jesus. Let's not get carried away." Because to really understand what the Bible is saying, to really understand the call of Jesus for us today, we need to practice repositioning ourselves. And the good news for us is that is exactly what Lent is about. Lent is more than just this season. It's more than just preparation for Easter. Lent is a practice of living. It's a way to live differently in the world. And this Lent, we are called to practice repositioning ourselves according to Jesus. Not to be constantly putting ourselves on top, not thinking about what is best for us, but how we can put ourselves last. And that starts with dust, with ashes on our foreheads. Because none of us can legitimately walk around with an ash cross on our foreheads and pretend like the world is ours for the taking. The ashes are a symbol of humility. And though it might only last for a night, this practice should stay with us. Imagine for a moment if your ash cross were to never wash off. Imagine if you wore it all the time. Would living with a cross of ashes on your forehead change your position at all? Would you start acting a little differently if you knew that you were always wearing those ashes? Of course, there are many other ways that we can work on repositioning ourselves during this time of Lent. If we're someone who easily puts ourselves in the position of victim, perhaps Lent can call us to consider ways in which we are also an offender. If we usually put ourselves in a place of judgment, Lent might position ourselves as judged, turning the judgment into ourselves. If we usually position ourselves as right or correct, Lent might be a time to consider ways in which we may occasionally be wrong. Think about which other ways God might be calling you to slightly reposition yourself. Chances are, it's not something you're especially excited about doing. I don't think the disciples were thrilled with the idea that the first will be last and that death is the way to life. One of the ways in which we as a congregation are going to live into this repositioning ourselves during Lent, is by reviewing these 4 values that our larger church body has created for us, which are curiosity, courage, compassion, and collaboration. And every Wednesday during Lent, we're going to take one of these values and look at how it might help us reposition ourselves in a little different way, to be more present with the people around us, to be more present with God. And repositioning is not easy work. It will probably not be something that everyone enjoys doing, but if you just need a little bit of help, I've got some words of encouragement for you tonight that you're going to hear in just a little bit. Remember, you are dust. On its surface, those words may not sound all that encouraging. In fact, to some of us, they may sound like bad news. Those words might remind you of the pain and the suffering of our human existence. They might remind you of mortality, and that is all true. But it is also not the end of the story. Because God is into this whole repositioning thing too. God took all the power and wisdom of the universe and repositioned into a human form. God took a cruel death on a cross and turned it into life for all. God took the meaningless, barren dust of the earth and breathed life into it. And tonight, God even takes the dust of our hearts and washes us with forgiveness. Takes the dust on our foreheads, the charred, ugly ashes, and repositions us to bring beauty and hope and life to a dusty world. Thanks be to God.